It's the 1st of July, 1916. As another bleak morning dawns over these scarred fields that lie beside the River Somme, Otto Lais, a machine gunner with the German 169th, opens his eyes after a night of fitful sleep. The air is already thick with the stench of cordite, mud, and sweat. As he shifts his body, muscles screaming from malnutrition and stress, Otto moves his journal from his chest. He'd fallen asleep mid-sentence again. As he readied himself for the day's fighting, he glanced at his last words, barely a legible scrawl, written just moments before he finally succumbed to exhaustion. When will they finally come? Moments later, a sentry's voice rang out through the dugout. Get out, they're coming." Immediately, Otto's mind tripped into high gear as adrenaline surged through his body. Seconds later, he and his 6-man team were scrambling from the underground shelter, dragging equipment through the shattered terrain. Finding a suitable crater, they hurled themselves down to face the advancing British. In less than 1 minute, Otto found himself looking down the sights of his Machne 08, a 70-kilogram, belt-fed, water-cooled beast, capable of firing 400 7.92mm rounds per minute. It could turn a man's body into mangled flesh from 2,000 meters. Fresh from training, Otto had yet to see it firsthand, but as the first few silhouettes emerged from the morning fog, his training would take over. He wasn't the first to squeeze the trigger, but his reaction was instinctive. With a deafening roar, the MG08 spat its first stream of bullets. The tightly packed khaki ranks of men were shredded, faces and chests erupting, men flung aside like rag dolls. Their screams instantly swallowed as the leading lines dissolved into ruin. Otto Lais was just one of thousands of MG08 gunners who operated on the front lines of World War I. However, he might be the only one to keep a detailed diary of his experiences. Otto Lais was brutally honest in his description of the toll that his duties took on him as part of the first generation to wield this incredible, new destructive weapon. Among other things, he recalled how his moments behind the gun were marked by cold dread, mingled with adrenaline, that over time seared away a part of the man that he had once been. Indeed, the MG08 and its counterparts represented a whole new dimension of battlefield horror, capable of inflicting catastrophic wounds and a degree of bodily destruction that rarely, if ever, had been seen before this industrialized war. In his diary, Otto took to processing his frontline experience not through emotion, but through cold, hard arithmetic. The human cost became a grim ledger. 250 shots, 1,000 shots, 3,000 shots, 5,000 shots. Still, there was no denying that each figure stood as a silent marker of what he had done. Yet this is not just Otto's story. It is the story of the machine gun itself, the men who wielded it, and how this single invention changed warfare forever. World War I was many things. Historians no doubt remember it as a true clash of empires, a spat among royalty that collapsed nations and changed European borders forever. But for the men who lived through it, it was a wholesale slaughter, and much of that had to do with the machine gun. Weapons like the MG08, the Hotchkiss MLE, and the Vickers Mark I didn't just support the fighting effort, they served to redefine it. Along both the eastern and western fronts, these new weapons turned offences into suicide, and both cavalry and infantry into meat for the grinder. Before 1914, warfare was still tethered to 19th century doctrine, which largely consisted of bayonet charges, cavalry runs, and massed lines of riflemen. But the machine gun shattered all of that. Through automatic weapons like the Machne gun, which had existed since the 1880s, World War I was the first conflict where machine guns would see widespread use. Combined with other relatively new inventions like barbed wire and landmines, the machine gun made surface-level warfare untenable, that the static horror of trenches soon became the only option. With rates of fire exceeding 400 rounds per minute, a small team could hold off an entire battalion. This forced generals to develop new strategies, such as the creeping barrage and new weapons like the tank. In many ways, the machine gun was the pivot point where modern warfare was born. It didn't just kill, it made killing efficient. It made it mechanical, relentless. Almost overnight, the romantic notions of war evaporated in smoke and screams. Men like Otto Lais took to calling their MG08s the devil's paintbrush, and rightfully so. With its high level of versatility and water-cooled design, the weapon could be set up in minutes, giving a 6-man team more firepower than a company would have had just a few years prior. But Germany was far from alone in developing this technology. The British had the Vickers, which itself could fire 600 rounds per minute and never quit, even when soaked in mud or drowned in rain. Crews would often joke that it would keep firing long after the war had ended. There were even stories of the Vickers machine gun firing for so long that its barrel actually melted. Despite these anecdotes, the medium Vickers machine gun was indescribably vicious, boasting a range of a massive 4,000 meters and even being adapted for use in aircrafts. The Brits also had the Lewis gun, a lighter, more mobile design that fired .303 caliber rounds from a magazine. Although it boasted a shorter range of just 800 meters, its rate of fire still averaged between 500 and 600 rounds per minute, allowing its 2-man team to suppress even large numbers of troops. A favourite of collectors, the Lewis gun is instantly recognisable due to its pan magazine, which spun like a phonograph record atop a circular barrel. The French and Americans mainly utilised the Hotchkiss MLE or the Chauchat CSRG. The former had a reputation for being dependable, but heavy. Most of the 7,000 or so constructed by the United States during World War I utilised a 250-round metal belt, which gave it a firing rate of around 450 to 600 rounds per minute. Its range was a solid 3,800 meters, though the gun required barrel changes every 1,000 rounds or so, during which the temperature of the barrel could reach 400 degrees C. The Chauchat was intended to be France's answer to the Lewis gun, but it was notoriously unreliable. When working correctly, it was capable of putting out 240 rounds per minute. But both the US and French troops often claimed that it would jam more than it would fire, especially in muddy conditions which were omnipresent in the First World War. Though they were undoubtedly efficient killing machines, these machine guns were hell to operate. Even the lighter weapons needed teams as well as carts, tools, barrels, and sometimes gallons upon gallons of water. Overheating was such a problem that when the water ran out, soldiers would often take turns urinating into the tanks just to keep the weapons from melting down. But if you thought that the machine gunners themselves were immune to the horrors or the risks, you'd be dead wrong. Owing to their tactical importance, machine gunners were not seen as mere infantrymen, they were instead seen as trained technicians. They had to know their weapons inside out and maintain them whilst operating in filth, mud, and dust. Every jam increased the possibility of instant death for the operators. From a strategic standpoint, machine guns were not tools but a system. And when that system broke down, it put everyone behind them at risk. Though some machine gun nests were improvised on the spot, others were more permanent, dug into the muck with sandbags, scraps of wood, and iron. While they did offer some shelter from the enemy charge, they also made soldiers like Otto Lais and his team a lightning rod for enemy artillery barrages. These men often slept beside their guns, fingers black with grease, eyes twitching at every sound. They lived ankle-deep in mud, surrounded by lice and rats. Over the course of weeks, sometimes months, they would resort to cooking over tin fires and drinking from shell holes. Night attacks were frequent, and they brought their own chaos-induced challenges. Living on the extremes of both boredom and terror wreaked havoc on the minds of machine gunners, as did the reality of their grisly duties. Their jobs were to ensure no man's land, the space between the trenches, lived up to its name. When enemy forces attempt to breach the area, they would use their high rates of fire to channel them into killing zones and prevent retreat. They were both the first and the last line of defense, and it worked. Some estimates attribute up to 40% of battlefield deaths directly to the machine guns. During attacks, a single machine gun team would witness horrors that most men would never have to see. Entire bodies reduced to clouds of red dust, flying limbs, and the skin on their comrades' hands peeling off from the heat and friction. Their job was a simple one. You kept shooting until the gun jammed, or you were killed. Those like Otto who survived World War I would recall killing hundreds and hundreds of men, stating that you either grew numb from the efforts or simply let it break you. Along with the great power machine gunners possessed came a significant amount of risk. They lived day in and day out with the horrible fact that everyone wanted them dead. Artillery zeroed on muzzle flashes, snipers looked for any signs of exposed flesh. If you did receive the order to retreat or move, you would be gunned down without hesitation. The casualty rates prove this. The British Machine Gun Corps alone suffered 62,000 casualties out of 170,000, a staggering 36%. In some battles, a machine gunner's life expectancy in combat was estimated at just 30 minutes. At times, commanders would use them as sacrificial lambs, ordering them to hold positions long enough to delay the enemy, but knowing full well that they would die under fire. As dusk fell on July 1st, 1916, the fields around the Somme were carpeted with corpses. The English had advanced in wave after wave, but Otto Lais and the other men from the 169th Infantry had managed to hold the line. We know from his writings that Otto himself personally fired over 18,000 rounds that day. A field of brass strewn out across his position. No man's land was now quiet. Only the occasional groan or call for a medic broke the silence. But inside, Otto's mind and body was screaming. His ears were ringing and full, as if he just travelled up and down a mountain. He would see many days, just like July 1st, before he would ever get a chance to see Germany again. He would later write of his experience that he remembers only chaos, saying, "Shooting, nothing but shooting. Barrel changing, hauling ammunition, laying out the dead and wounded in the bottom of the trench. Such is the harsh and furious pace of the morning of 1st of July, 1916. The Battle of the Somme would rage for another 5 full months after that morning, leaving roughly 500,000 casualties on both sides. And it was just one of many World War I battles in which machine gunners would play a pivotal role, even if it crushed their humanity. For Otto, his time behind the MG08 was a curse he carried long after the trenches fell silent.